think I am going to kick off because we have quite a packed agenda ahead of us, and I'm going to start with a little bit of introduction anyway. So hopefully all the other attendees will be able to join us over the next couple of minutes. I think I'm happy that we can now start with the presentation proper. So to give you a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today, this is our first evaluation webinar. So we're really excited to have such a large number of attendees with us. We have 200 people registered to attend. And what we're going to be doing is going over step one of our evaluation cycle. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to TASO for those of you who don't know who we are, but very brief. Then I will be moving on to an intro to our evaluation cycle and the diagnose stage. Before we talk about theories of change. So this session is very much about how you can develop a theory of change, and also how you can use a theory of change to devise your measures of success. So that's a brief overview of what we're going to be covering. So to give you just a reminder of who TASO is, we are an independent hub. We're set up for HE professionals to access research, toolkits, evaluation techniques and more to help widen participation and improve equality within the sector. So we are currently set up by King's College London, Nottingham Trent University and the Behavioural Insights team, but we are spinning out as an independent charity in due course, and we are an affiliate What Works Centre, so part of the government's What Works movement. We're funded by the Office for Students at the moment until April 2022. So today, myself, I'm Eliza Cosman, Deputy Director of Research at TASO, and I spoke at our previous Get to Know TASO events, but I'm really pleased to introduce our Establishment Evaluation Manager, Miriam Stiernor, who's going to lead the way today, has put together our evaluation guidance and is going to step you through this webinar step by step. So I will hand over to Miriam.
Hello everyone, as Eliza said, my name is Miriam. I'm the Establishing Evaluation Manager, so led in collaboration with the wider TASO team and our great working groups and advisory panels on establishing evaluation guidance that TASO is now promoting. I'm really excited to be here today. It's the first time I'm doing a theory of change workshop in a remote setting, so hopefully the technology will be in our favor. We have quite a packed agenda, so I'm going through the slides now. There will be, as Eliza said, time for questions in between our slides and the Q&A session at the end, but I have a tendency to talk relatively quickly. So as Eliza already said, in case you don't catch anything, we will distribute the slides later. So, theories of changes in our evaluation, how can this help you? So what we hope to do today is that the first of our 3 webinars will guide you through the process of evaluating your schemes and activities and help you understand how TASO's recommendation for monitoring and evaluation activity can apply to you, no matter where you are in the evaluation cycle, whether you're already really robustly evaluating your activities for several years, or whether you're completely new to evaluation and have to kind of get to grips to what the sector is producing every year. So we will guide you through the development of your theory of change model, which is essential for all of our initiatives, and it sets out how your intended outcomes of the initiatives can help you achieve those outcomes, and how you can then kind of enable and deploy your resources to achieve those outcomes and long-term impacts. As I mentioned, it's the first of 3 webinars, and that will talk you through our so-called evaluation cycle. I've worked in widening participation for the better part of 5 years now. And one of the questions I always get when I'm working with practitioners, but also APP authors or the university stuff is, when is the best time to actually evaluate an initiative? And although it's probably a no-brainer that evaluation is more effective and credible when it is built in from the beginning, because with everything else, if you plan accordingly, you can foresee a lot of the challenges. You can also apply evaluation retroactively to existing or already completed initiatives. But what is important for us at TASO is that an effective evaluation is not just an event that occurs at the end of an initiative as a nice add-on, but that it's very much an ongoing process. So we consider evaluation to be reiterative. something that the circular design of our evaluation cycle obviously indicates. It's an iterative process that supports continuous improvement. So the findings of your evaluation that you might measure in like the step that is called measure here can then feed into the refinement of your theory of change, your research questions and your research methods. And the reflect phase of our evaluation cycle is very much around like thinking how you can use your evaluative findings as a foundation of your activities, and that can then trigger more like action rather than just an end product in and by itself. What we also hope with that iterative cycle is that it will help you to identify more robust findings. And over time, when you start seeing that your initiatives produce the same kind of outcomes and impact findings every year, you'll be in a much more robust position to say and claim this is the impact of our program in general, rather than just a fluke of a specific year. So today we are going to focus on the first step, the diagnose phase, which is mostly around how to establish or revise a theory of change and how we can make it appropriate for the program life stage that your program is trying to address. So before we start, as I said, we're keeping this content relatively broad. So I just quickly want to touch up on what a theory of change is and how it can help us. So a theory of change is a key tool for us that can help with an effective evaluation. It is not a specific theory of how to plan your initiative and of how to know whether what you're doing is a good or a bad idea, but it is a tool that enables you to plan your initiative step by step and helps you to identify possible pitfalls early so you can be prepared for the complex process of achieving your outcomes later on. It hereby helps initiative owners, so that can be a WP practitioner, the evaluator, as I said, the APP author, or anyone else interested in widening participation in higher education evaluation, to identify and succinctly describe the context and needs of a program and how that specific program design is going to address situations and goals that you set for it. As you probably all know, like the programs that you are running or that you're involved with are highly context specific. And a theory of change is a really, really nice framework that offers a harmonized approach to accommodate the variety of different contexts that we are working in, and allows us to use a tool that is somehow comparable without losing all that really great nuance that we have in the sector. Second of all, it is a tool that can help with offering, as I said, a structured process of questioning your ideas and assumptions. So also change that we are trying to achieve with all our outreach and outreach activities is really complex, and it's quite an elephant task to think about a program that can help decrease the BAME attainment gap or to bring in more quintile polar 1 students. So a theory of change can be really, really helpful here in developing your own personalized theory of what will change when you put your ideas into practice. And lastly, once you've clearly identified your needs and your desired change, it then also allows you to design and conceptualize your activities in a way that maximizes and optimizes their delivery. So again, you can make sure that everything you spend your money and your resources and your time and your students' time on is achieving as good an outcome as possible. So overall, it is a really, really versatile tool that can be of use to all your program stakeholders. It improves your strategy as it clearly outlines the wider long-term impacts of a program. It facilitates communication across all your different stakeholders, may it be local partner schools, other staff in universities, or sector regulators. And lastly, it also helps to improve working with your other stakeholders, because you can increase buy-in by including all these stakeholders in the design of the theory of change, but also it increases accountability because you really know who's doing what and when. So again, now that we know what the theory of change is, as I mentioned, I've worked in quite a lot of settings, and I've probably done north of 50 theory of change workshops, never on Zoom, so this is the first for me. And I've encountered quite a lot of questions and situations where the theory of change has been really helpful in working through different programs. So as I mentioned before, like a lot of projects in the widening participation scheme seem to work really well in the pilot, because you do it with a really small number of students, and the one-on-one intense support that you are like supporting to that small number seems to work really well. And now the question is, how do we scale that pilot project up to increase the original impact to a wider participant pool? A theory of change can help with scaling up the relevant areas while also keeping a really clear focus on what elements need to be in place to monitor whether the scale up is working really well. Whether that is like including more participants and reducing some of the non-essential program items, or whether that is you've got the additional resources to scale it up like in exactly the form that you did in the pilot. How can we make sure that like these resources again are being used in the best way? Another issue that we often have is also that people think it just takes too long, or it's not a good measure of my time because it's a bit of a box ticking exercise. And I've encountered that numerous times in my like evaluation career, where like evaluation has been forgotten, or a lot of times just didn't seem like the best way that we should spend our limited resources. And that is definitely true when you're running a program delivery, and evaluation is definitely the least of your priorities when you have to have safeguarding issues and deliver an event. But a theory of change can be really useful here because you can, as I said, front load a lot of the work, and it also not only reduces the time, but also the stress that comes with evaluating alongside your program delivery, because you clearly outline what you need to happen, what needs to happen when and who's doing it, and where necessary, if you see kind of funnels arising, you can make sure that your evaluation measurements take into account when your program might be too busy to evaluate. So yeah, this is just some of the situation the theory of change can help you. But obviously the question now is, after I've talked about all the great advantages of that framework, how can you apply it to your contexts? So it can be difficult to envision, as I said before, how you achieve this really large scale social change. And I've been in a lot of meetings where I like kind of shook my head and thought like, oh, I don't know if you can measure this. It seems really dauntingly impossible and overwhelming to think about it. But the really, really great thing that I've seen in every single one of my workshops is by working through these different elements and breaking down that social task into feasible, realistic steps of how you achieve your desired change really, really helps to make it realistic. So it can help break down these components. And what we'd like to do today in this workshop is basically design a theory of change with you. So I think in our preparatory reading, we sent out this template. So if some of you are already familiar with theories of change, then you will recognize a lot of these elements. Obviously, the elements and all of that design is not set in stone, but from my experience, this model works for 95% of the programs I've seen. And for matters of simplicity, this is what we're working through today in the workshop. So what you'll see is, even though the elements are quite like similar to other frameworks that you might have seen already, is that the numbering is quite different. So we jump really quickly from identifying the situation and aims our programs are addressing to the impact side of our program. And we're doing that because we want to have an impact-focused delivery and program design. And by moving to that side of the journey very quickly, we make sure that everything that we do after identifying our outcomes and impacts is actually focusing on those outcomes and impacts. So we slowly move away from making program and evaluation deliveries only process focused. And you'll have a really clear journey at the end from your inputs all the way to your impacts, and making sure that everything aligns according to your impacts. So as I said before, if you have your own theory of change that you'd like to work through, you can obviously use that template and fill it out as we go along. If you're really new to evaluation, or you just like to know how we approached it, we are using an example of a summer school, as this is a quite well-known initiative in this sector, and also because TASO is actually planning to evaluate a summer school RCT next year. So we're using a theory of change to evaluate our summer school program. And we've got the situation and the aim clearly outlined here. So it's common that many students, and that's particularly true for widening participation and underrepresented students, indicate that they feel quite unprepared for higher education, and that may contribute to a feeling of alienation when they arrive. Oftentimes, underrepresented groups also don't have the social networks to kind of understand and make an informed understanding of university-style teaching or university communities, and often have a gap in knowledge around how to apply to universities sometimes. So the aim of the summer school that we're trying to evaluate here is to equip our participants with the knowledge and insight to make these high quality applications to higher education providers, and to debunk the myth of higher education as an elite environment towards something that is really inclusive and where they feel like they belong. So in the next couple of slides, we're basically developing each element of the theory of change. So if you could all kind of familiarize yourself again with this template, and if you're working through it, make sure that you've got that ready when we go through the next slides. Otherwise, if you're interested to see how we're approaching it, just follow the slides going on. I'm briefly pausing here in case there are any questions. So Eliza, kindly facilitates this. So are there any questions?
Yeah, so while everyone gets their templates sorted, I will just run through a few questions. Miriam, I don't think, I certainly can't see your video at the moment, so I don't know if you're able to turn that on, or perhaps I'm doing it wrong. But these are, so some of the key questions that have come through. So Martin Archer says, how does a theory of change compare or contrast with a logic model? And what are the benefits, drawbacks of both approaches to planning?
Mm-hmm. So we actually address that question in our monitoring and evaluation framework that we'll reflect on later in the slides. So there's a variety of names, and depending on the foci, like a theory of change is sometimes called a logic model, because the idea behind it is to have like a logical chain that goes into it. Like for our purposes, we think it is an interchangeable term. But we like the theory of change a bit better because it is the theory around how you apply your change. And there is a lot more nuance involved in like what the context allows you to put into.
Great, okay. And this is a question from Donna Franklin, who says, do you suggest a theory of change for each APP commitment / projects, and how best to share with the wider institution?
That's a good question. So I think it really depends on your resources. I mean, obviously, the ideal scenario would be that you have a really, really clearly outlined evaluation narrative and the theory of change for all your initiatives. But that's just not always possible because we work with limited resources. What I would suggest, and that is again up to the higher education provider, is to probably focus on your main impact activities first. So that could either be your established activities, or it could be activities that are maybe more cost intensive, where you expect that there is a higher impact to be claimed. Also, a lot of times, what you can see is that maybe some of your initiatives address the same kind of aims and situations. So you could like bundle similar initiatives into one theory of change if appropriate.
Lovely, thank you. And apparently everyone else can see Miriam's video, so sorry about that. That's just me getting Zoom wrong. And there's a couple of questions just about the template, which I think, so it was sent through in the pre-reading materials, but if you don't have that, and if it's not editable, but you can just draw it out as you go. So, and we'll be using this template throughout the webinar, so you don't have to kind of edit a proper Word version or anything like that. It's just for you to be aware that we'll be using this format going forward. So I think we'll wrap up the questions there and press on with the next slide so we keep to time.
Brilliant. So working through the theory of change now, as I said, we have this really clear numbering. We've identified the situation and aim here already. So the next step for us will be to look at the outcomes. Before we, however, start thinking about the outcomes, I quickly wanted to raise your awareness to the difference between outputs and outcomes. From my experience, a lot of times people struggle a bit to distinguish between the two, and a lot of times use them interchangeably. So to get the context right, I'm going to use an example that has nothing to do with higher education. So it was my nephew's 6th birthday a few months ago. So imagine that I went to the local bakery and ordered a dinosaur-themed cake for the morning of the party. If I asked a group of people about the outcome of this transaction, most people will tell me that the outcome is the birthday cake. But that's actually not correct. The outcome of this will be a delighted birthday boy and a group of happy cake-filled 6-year-olds. The cake itself is the output provided by the bakery. It's a direct deliverable out of my transaction, where the outcome is a short to medium goal. If the cake had not been tasty, or if the bakery had delivered, I don't know, like a frozen themed birthday cake, then the desired outcome, the happy kids, the happy boy's birthday party, would in all probability not have been achieved. So there's a clear differentiation between the outputs and the outcomes, the direct deliverable that you'll just expect to see after you deliver an initiative as expected, and the short to medium-term goals that you want to see out of those outputs. So translating this example to our theory of change framework now, looking at outcomes, we will now offer you about 1.5 minutes to think through your own project, or like just stay with us when we talk about the summer school project and think about your outcomes. So again, the short to intermediate term outcomes, which must be in place for your intervention to work in order to achieve your long-term goals. And when you've done that, we'll come back and then we can talk through our outcomes for the summer school. Okay. I hope this wasn't too short. I'm really aware that it's quite difficult to do this in isolation. So hopefully when I'll talk through our outcomes now, it becomes a bit clearer and you can hopefully see some of your thought processes mirrored. So the outcomes for our summer school scenario. How do we break the task of inclusive, welcoming campuses with well-informed applicants down, right? So that's what I meant before with this elephant task of social change. So thinking about the medium-term goals of students participating in the summer schools, we assume that the sessions that look at how to apply to a university will increase their understanding of the statement writing process, but it will also increase their knowledge on the subject of their choice. So if they want to apply to our medical school, they'll have a better understanding of what it entails to study medicine, and that will kind of translate into a better application to the program. Likewise, having learned about all of these elements that go into the application, we not only expect that we have a higher increase in our participants applying to higher education providers, but also that some of those are much more successful than without the summer school. So situating this, and it will become more obvious as we go through this, you can see that like none of these are guaranteed deliverables, right? Just attending the summer school doesn't mean that people will apply to the university and that it will be much more successful. But if we put the right outputs in place, it will become a much clearer logical chain, and the change that we want to achieve will become much clearer. So we will do that in the next steps now, because now that we've established our short to medium term goals, we'll look at impacts. So impacts is a bit work. And just to reiterate again, like what I sometimes tell in our workshops is that outputs are something that will happen as a direct result of your activity. Your specified outcomes could happen, and your impacts is what you realistically hope to happen. So whilst you're in direct control of your outputs, providing your activities are delivered as plans, and your outcomes are somehow attached to that, impacts are much more subject to external factors that can compromise your long-term impacts. So following the outcomes we've identified, think about long-term goals relating to your situation and aim, and think about the results that will come from removing the situation and problem that you've identified in your project, or for us in the summer school, and how you're trying to address that. Just for information, I've included some example of potential impacts that are listed here. So those are just some examples, not necessarily in relation to your program or the summer school, but it's about goals that your initiative seeks to address. in general, what I would say here as a word of caution is be ambitious but realistic. So of course we want to like achieve as best and as ambitious an outcome as possible, but if you've got a pilot program, maybe also like think about what claims you can actually make in evidence. So depending on, again, where you are in your program life stage, like put your impacts in accordingly. And the more you get to know about your program, the more ambitious your impacts can be without jeopardizing whether you can actually realistically measure that. So again, what we're doing now is I'll give you about a minute and a half again to just think about your impacts or to read through our theory of change for the summer school, and then I'll talk through the impacts we've identified. Brilliant. I hope that wasn't too short again. Again, we'll share the video so you can always rewind and stop and work from there. Looking at our impacts for the summer school, there we are. You can see clearly here, like now we've got that step from the outcomes, i.e. higher applications that are more successful to higher education providers, increased social networks that come through the summer schools, increased subject-specific knowledge, how these can flow into long-term impact. So we'll have like a more diversified student body because underrepresented groups enter the universities. We've got increased social capital among individuals, and there's a higher sense of belonging indicated for all these students. So you can see now we've moved from the impacts, from the outcomes in the medium to short term to the long-term impacts. We always say this is what you hope to happen because there's a lot, as I mentioned, of external factors that can kind of jeopardize this. So your program can work as perfectly as you've planned it, but if, surprise, surprise, a global pandemic might hit, all of this could be quite jeopardized and it would be completely out of your control. Nevertheless, what it can do is, if aside from these external factors that put everything upside down, it can give you this logical chain between the outcomes to the impacts and how you know what you need to measure and when you measure it. So again, breaking down this elephant task a bit more. So following from the impacts, now that we've identified the impact side of the theory of change, we're jumping to the outputs bit. So the next area I want to focus on is activities and outputs. As mentioned before, outputs are direct deliverables from your activity. So what will happen rather than could happen, and they're directly in your control. Keeping in mind, when I buy my birthday cake, the cake is the output, not an outcome. So think about the outcomes we've identified for the theory of change in the summer school or what you've been working on and the impacts that follow from that. What kind of outputs do now need to be in place in order to achieve this impact? So what we always say here when we do the workshops is these initiatives follow your outcomes. It's not the other way around. So then think about the actions and activities that you need to design to achieve your particular outcome and output. Again, I'll give you about a minute and a half now to think this through. We might want to do questions because I'm aware that I've jumped through these three elements and you might have some.
Yes, I think we'll pause here to just answer a
Yeah.
few of the questions which have come through. So some really good ones. Just to answer Victoria Geary straight away, can they have an editable version of the template afterwards? Yes, absolutely, we'll circulate that. So there's a question here about distinguishing between long-term goals and medium-term goals. How would you make that distinction, Miriam?
Yeah, and I think it's actually really good to have both in there and to clearly identify them. So I think short-term goals are something that is much closer to the end of your program than the medium-term goals. So if you, for example, think about the summer school, you might want to do a pre and a post knowledge test in regards to subject-specific knowledge, and you could do one at the end of the summer school, which would be like either direct, which could be an output. But then if you want to do it 6 months later to see whether that lift in knowledge actually was sustained or not, that could become an outcome. And that could very much be then we've got a sustained like subject level knowledge, or we've got sustained aspiration towards higher education. So that could be a relatively straightforward way to look at how your output triggers into like short or medium term outcome.
Lovely. And a similar question actually from Charlotte Gorn. So she says, with work with younger students, for example, primary students that focus on short-term goals such as attainment, where would the larger long-term goal like university attendance come into the theory of change?
It's a good point. And again, it depends a bit on the life cycle of your program. So if you're doing it for the first time, again, if it's about raising attainment, then if that's the first time you're running the program, I think it's absolutely fine to test all your theory and have like some kind of lift level in attainment as the impact. If you've been running the program for 3 years and you've got really clearly defined data collation methods and you know how to recruit your participants and how to make these robust attainment raising level claims, you could go a bit higher and say, oh yeah, as a result of this, we've seen that in the next key stage, our participants are doing like significantly better than a comparator group, etc. So again, like what you define as an outcome or an impact in the first place depends a bit how much you already know about your initiative.
Thanks, Mary.
No more questions? Okay. Okay, so we've defined outcomes and impact. So what activities and outputs do we need to have in place for the summer school to understand to get to these outcomes and impacts? So what we've got here, thinking about outputs, like what we need is that what we expect to see if all our participants come to the summer school is that they have a better understanding of university style teaching. And to a certain extent, it is an output, not an outcome, because for example, if I went into a webinar on evaluation, I can guarantee you that I'll learn something new about evaluation. It's just a guarantee. Even though I might already know a lot, it's just guaranteed that there is some element in it that will make me get to know evaluation better. If I went to a summer school at King's, I guarantee you I'll learn more about King's. So it's a direct deliverable here, but we need that better understanding of university style teaching to then feed into our outcome that students like have a better understanding about what campus communities look like, and that they then like aspire to apply and get in and have that sense of belonging. So you've got a clear logic chain there. The same is true if you think about providing academic capital. So you get to meet academic members of staff. You learn about like what university style teaching looks like, and you might realize whether you identify with that kind of teaching or not. Again, this is really crucial, and then translating into how students apply and hopefully successfully apply to higher education. And then when they get to university, how they feel like they belong and get on at university. And in order to have these outputs in place, and now hopefully you'll slowly start seeing how it becomes a theory of change and a chain of change. You need to provide all of these activities. You need to have taster lectures that get students a first-hand experience. You need to have like sessions and campus visits that get them to know the campus community. You need to have sessions that advise them on applications, etc., etc. So they slowly trickle down. And ideally what you then have is, oh yeah, if this happens, that happens, and then that happens. So having done that, the last step here is thinking about the inputs that you need in order to in order to deliver your activities. So inputs are tangible and intangible resources that are required to carry out your activities. When thinking about your inputs, think about what you'll need to invest in the initiative. So it could be tangible, intangible, operational. It can be everything from obviously your staff, your funds, the budget, a venue to hold all of the activities, but it can also be things that you can't quite measure that easily. So if you've got buy-in from your manager or your vice chancellor who might want to do something really innovative or is a big fan of a summer school, but also maybe your reputation or subject-specific knowledge that you're really good at. So you attract the partner schools you want to, or you attract the funding in order to get project funding in. And then operational things as well, like thinking a bit about like the structure of your team and what you've got available to you. Think about things like, the promotion material that I have to have in place and how much time I actually need to spend on this. It's easy here with inputs to have an ever ongoing list of inputs. If you want to go into granular detail, and to a certain extent, it's good to have that because, as I mentioned before, the theory of change makes you acknowledge shortfalls that you might have in your theory of change, or things where like the theory of how you're running the program might not quite match the reality. So this is a situation where you could think about, do I actually have enough resources to deliver this scenario, and where do I might need to amend it? But when you put these inputs into your theory of change, try to be like there's a SMART principle to try to be exhaustive by being concise. So what we're doing now is putting in the inputs, but before we discuss it, I'll just check with Eliza if we have questions.
I was muted, sorry. Yes, we do have one question. So this is from Samuel Gayapon. He says he works with an organisation where they provide evidence to support higher education institutions, and they have influence over their research activities and outputs, but not over their outcomes and impact. So how do they track their outcomes and impact as they don't have control of them? Yeah. I suppose, I don't know if you want to flag our upcoming webinars, Miriam, because I suppose that kind of goes beyond a theory of change.
Yeah. It definitely does. And I'll allude to it a bit when we talk about how to measure it. In general, I think what normally happens with the theory of change workshop, and due to the current situation, we can't quite make it as interactive, is that you would put the major stakeholders into the room. So if you realize that like the key holder of your outcomes and impacts might need to be in the room to discuss how you get access to that data, and how you could track it, it might be worth thinking whether it would be worth to schedule an interactive session with everyone to talk through whether that data can become available and if they could allocate a bit of time to provide that to you, or whether likewise they could get involved in doing that for you. I know there are limitations there, but as Liza said, we're actually doing a seminar on what kind of data is actually commonly available in this sector, especially for institutions who don't have the resources to do everything in-house. And we'll talk a bit more around how we can track things in the long term.
That's it for now, Mary.
Brilliant. Okay, so now looking at inputs. So what we would need for the summer schools are most obviously the participants. So making sure that we've got the rapport with partner schools and that we'll have like a steady flow of participants coming in that would justify for us to do all of those activities. We need student ambassadors who help us deliver the activities. We need the academic and non-academic support staff, obviously the budget, the buy-in, all the different elements that I've mentioned before. And now when we've got that in place, we can see how all of those resources are necessary to design our activities, who capture all of our outputs, and then flow beyond the program from the short all the way to the long-term view into our outcomes and impacts. So all of that is great in theory, but what is really important to consider here is obviously that I didn't take any external factors into account at this. This was just us thinking through what is the best theory for me to achieve, like the increased offers to higher education providers, the diversified student body, right? And I need to be really mindful that what I'm claiming here is not only realistic, but also evidence-based. So the last step after we've designed our theory is to think about the rationale and assumptions. So I really like this comic from Fresh Spectrum. What's really important here is that your decisions are underpinned by evidence to show that your intended effect is anticipated to have the impact that is realistic and feasible. So in general, working through your theory of change, revisit your assumptions and the rationale behind them. So are you sure that A leads to B? And is that the direction of travel for your desired impact? And why are you sure about it? Make sure that you, as I said, maybe refer to research that has been done in the sector, or if research isn't there, that you set up your theory of change in the first instance to bring you that evidence to underline your hypothesis. So what we use for the summer schools, for example, is the evidence synthesis that we've commissioned from the Education Policy Institute, and that collected the evidence that we needed to demonstrate the links in our theory of change. So again, I'll give everyone a minute and a half now to think about rationale and assumptions for their own projects, or then to talk about what we had as rationale and assumptions for our summer school. Brilliant. I hate that I can't discuss this with you. It would be so much nicer to have everyone there, but it's just not feasible with 200 participants. But yeah, I hope that you had a bit of a chance to think things through. Again, a minute and a half is obviously not enough time for you to think all of this through in a lot of detail. And hopefully when we publish the video, you can rewind and think about it. But also we are referring to some of the resources we've already published at TASO. So yeah, make sure that you also reference those when you think about your own theory of change. So rationale and assumptions for the summer school. So according to survey data, for example, from the education phase that EPI found, we found that a lot of the people actually stay local to the university, and that a lot of people don't travel that much. And those that do are like quite a distinct group. So in order to achieve proportional representation of WP students beyond London, we would need to have supplementary information, etc. And like all of that review, and the same that the EPI review has shown us, there's actually quite a lot of evidence that underlines that the activities in summer schools, especially the amalgamation of the social aspect, the academic aspect, and the support in regards to this is the next steps you need to do if you want to apply to university, are really well researched, not necessarily with a causal link, but like really promising evidence that would allow for us to say this is an activity that we should we should have, and that is worth evaluating. So as I said before, it's not like obviously 46 minutes is like speeding through this theory of change, but I hope what I've showed you in that 3/4 of an hour is how we broke down getting a more diversified student body in a higher education provider, and how we can increase sense of belonging for students, all the way down to like starting with student ambassadors and participants and external buy-in, and how each of these steps in them by themselves are relatively feasible and okay to devise, and how then coming all of those together, you can start seeing maybe where things are a bit are not quite as aligned, and where you need to reconsider how to design this. So that concludes the theory part of the theory of change. What obviously the next big question is, once you've got the perfect theory in place, is how you measure if your theory of change is working. So what the theory of change can do, it tells you how you can achieve the change, but like when you're achieving it and like how you're actually getting the data for it, you need to operationalize your theory. So what that means is you need to collect the data that is a good proxy for your theory. And that is just as important, obviously, because we need to understand, and that's what the theory of change helps you, is whether your outputs, your outcomes, and your impacts are actually testable. As we've already alluded to, that will actually be the focus of our next webinar, because it requires a bit more than the 60 minutes available to us. But we briefly want to touch upon this in the next slide. So an outcome measure is, it tells you that you've reached your outcome, for example, a better sense of belonging when you see an indicator X. So an indicator is a thing that you can tangibly measure. They don't need to be a perfect match to your outcome concept, but they need to be valid enough to give you a good proxy. So there are observable indicators, so clearly identifiable information that we can easily build into an evaluation because we can measure it. So it could be demographic information like age, but also observed behavior like engagement. So for the summer school, we can take a register that tells us how old a student is, and we can take a register that tells us how well they engage with the sessions. However, there are also unobservable indicators, so those we can't easily measure and that we cannot build into the evaluation because we don't have indicators for this. So that can be unobserved behavior. For example, the motivation of a participant or the perception of HE they have because like in the young person's home, there is a better or like a not that good understanding of higher education. So things that we can't measure that easily. And to be honest, from my experience, finding the best proxy measure is a lot of times the most difficult bit in higher education evaluation. And you shouldn't do this alone. You are the experts on the program on how to run it. But what TASO is also trying to do now, because not everybody has an evaluation team that can provide you with like the plenty of data that's out there, we've started collating commonly used outcome measures in higher education and how they're available or how you can set them up really easily within your institution and how those can then translate into your measurable outcomes. So we've created a framework that we call the Common Outcome Measures Framework, which is part of our monitoring and evaluation framework that you can find over leaves. This is just an excerpt of it. So we've split the Common Outcome Measures Framework into year groups, because obviously certain year groups have specific objectives and need specific data for it. But also we've clearly put them into objectives and then indicators for your process and for your impact evaluation. So Key Stage 4, years 10 to 11, a lot of times has raising attainment as a really good objective or increasing awareness of subject options in higher education. Process evaluation indicators can be, was the program delivered as intended? So, for example, did you have X amount of participants engage? Did all the programs run as you intended them to do, etc.? And then indicators for short to medium term could be GCSE attainment through the MPD data if you got access to it. And then impact evaluation could be long-term tracking via HEAT, for example. And likewise, if you think about Key Stage 2 and increased knowledge and confidence, you can have the same process indicators, but you can implement pre and post common survey questions for the short to medium term measurement. And then likewise, for the long-term measurement, you could think about progression to higher educations via HEAT, or in the long term, you could also think maybe using something like the graduate outcome survey. So we've created this outcome measures framework for each of the key stages and then post entry to higher education with some of the data that we've identified. And then we, in our wider documents, and Eliza will talk about that a bit, we also talk about the outcome measures that are available. So obviously some of your programs are quite unique. So you may need to create indicators outside of those that we provide in the Common Outcome Measures Framework. For these, you will just need to consider how reliable and valid your indicators are. So more information can be found about this in the documents, and we can support you to understand that in the next webinar. But key is choosing the most reliable and valid indicator that you have. So for example, when we think about pre and post common survey questions, like skills that are previously verified by academics, for example, are always better than ones that we just create out of the blue, because we couldn't pre-test them in the same way that those validated skills are. And indicators where you don't need to ask participants to give you subjective answers are always better than questions where people need to self-report. So as an example of that would be self-identified spending. If you'd asked me how much money I used to spend on eating out, I probably would have underestimated that. Whereas now, like where we can't go to restaurants that easily, I actually realized that I would have not given you an accurate subjective answer to it. And the same is true for when we ask participants to report on their aspiration or their knowledge increase. So where possible, always ask objective subject knowledge questions. With that, I'll hand it over back to Eliza, because we quickly want to touch up on the resources that we have created for you with TASO. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That's brilliant. Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, just to quickly touch on this, obviously all of this evaluation guidance has come from guidance which is being ratified by our advisory groups, academic and evaluators, and it's available on our website. So we have a 4-stage kind of process you can walk through, which is diagnose, plan, measure, reflect. Please do take a look at that. And our upcoming webinars as well. I won't dwell on this too long. If we can skip over these last few slides, Miriam, because I think we'd like to wrap up on the hour, because we're conscious other people will have other meetings to go to. We have some really good questions that I think it would be good to answer before we wrap up. Alexandra Lyons and Martin Archer both asked quite similar questions in terms of how much we should draw on educational or social research in terms of developing the theory of change to ensure it's realistic. So backing up those assumptions, how much is it about drawing on the research, and how do we do that, and how do we reflect that in our theory of change?
Yeah, I think as much as possible. Because within reasons, of course, because again, there are limitations, and you could easily spend the year just doing a literature review and it would still not be exhaustive. But you get a really good idea once you start going through some of the educational research. And just quickly going back here, we're actually starting an evidence toolkit where we start collating what evidence is available for like the most common programs that we're running. So for example, that was being run in the sector. So for example, summer schools. And we've kind of done a lot of the synthesis around like, oh, this is the evidence that's out there. This is what seems to be like going well. And this is the impact that the evidence is having. So I would say like be realistic around how much time you can allocate to researching and evidence synthesis, and hopefully the evidence code that we've developed will help you like kind of shorten that a bit, but make sure that you have some understanding that is evidence-based around what you're doing. Again, sometimes with unique programs, and there's always a context that doesn't apply to you, but you can acknowledge that. And a good theory of change will tell you if your findings don't quite match with the evidence, where it might not be the case. Is that because it wasn't intended, it wasn't implemented as intended, or was it because the theory is failing and we need to reconsider like how the change actually happens?
Yeah, and I think if I can add to that, I think the process of sitting down and crystallizing your assumptions and laying them out quite starkly in front of you can sometimes shake out that need for going away and looking for more evidence. And sometimes you find that it's just not there, or it's somehow something you do need to delve into in a bit more detail. So definitely a really good point to bring up. So I have a question from Leanne Campbell, which is, how can we nest a number of theory of change models into an overarching theory of change for a suite of activities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really useful if you do that. So what you can do is basically in the template, you can start putting different activities together. So your activities can almost be the inputs in the beginning, and then you can like go from there. So if summer schools are about, increasing awareness and application numbers, and then on top of that, you might have IAG sessions that go into the same barrier. You can basically cluster them together, and you can then make sure that within your theory of change, you've got the range of variety of impacts that your suite of programs are trying to address, but you still have a really clear logic chain, how different programs feed into different activities, will then feed into the outputs and outcomes and impacts accordingly. We can see I might have a nested theory of change that I can share for an AAP, but I'll need to look at that because obviously it might be sensitive. But if possible, I'll see if we can include that in the follow-up.
That's lovely, thanks Miriam. And I think time for just one more question, which is from Ryan Grant. And he says, is there a point where an intervention might be too small in its impact to justify creating a theory of change? Yeah. Or where the timescales to create the outcome impact stages is too small?
Yeah, it's a good question again. And to be honest, it is context specific. So again, if your team resources don't allow for a lot of theories of change, there is a bit around, again, prioritizing how important that pilot is. If you think it's a promising project where you really want to get a better understanding of the evidence base, again, ideally you have a theory of change for every program. But if you, for example, have a really small program, that you think is providing promising evidence, yes, it's worth creating a theory of change. And even though it might not give you the robust findings that would allow you to do like some fancy methodology like an RCT, you can still get really, really great case studies out of there. And having said that, most programs start with small numbers to start with. And this is a really good way for you to get an understanding, again, how the theory of change happens and how you can then slowly but like measurably scale it up for bigger programs if you want to. But also, if you don't want to because the program works perfectly as it is and that's the impact that you're happy with, then yes, the theory of change can also be really useful there. But again, if your resources don't allow it, think about like how important is that program for you in regards to the suite of robust findings that you want to deliver in the end.
Great. So I think we have 2 minutes until the hour. So I think we're going to wrap it up there, lest we run over, because I do want to say a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Miriam so much for delivering the actual webinar. I do want to flag that we have our next evaluation webinar in 2 weeks, which is on step 2 plan. And then steps 3 and 4, which are measure and reflect, are 2 weeks after that. So we're spacing these out every Wednesday. And these are all being recorded. So we want to make sure that we cascade this back out to the sector and making sure that we really take every opportunity to share these resources because they are freely available to you. We also really would love your feedback. So please do look out for the questionnaire, which will come out to you. And please do provide feedback, which can help us improve for next time. And with that, we will sign off and hopefully see you all, if not in a couple of weeks, then at a future evaluation webinars.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.